Amy, Australia, September 2nd. Amy woke as light spread across her pillow. It took her a moment to remember where she was. Then it all flooded back. Robbie had been kidnapped and Mum had dumped her at Sarah's house to keep her out of the way. There was a murmur beside her, and she turned to see Mum asleep in the bed opposite. She slipped out of bed and crept across the room. Her mum had dark circles under her eyes, her hair spread out across the pillow, still up in the ponytail she wore to work. Amy carefully pulled the doona aside and climbed in beside her, snuggling down in the crook of her arm. Despite her care, Mum woke up. Amy, her voice was barely more than a croak. She didn't say anything else, but held Amy tightly. Amy closed her eyes and hugged her back. It couldn't have been more than 10 minutes before Amy heard someone moving in the room. She opened her eyes. Catherine was standing there, looking down at them and smiling. "Time to get up, Amy. You will be late for school," Catherine said. "I want to stay with Mum," Amy said. It was no good. Mum opened her eyes and sat up with a groan. "You should go to school, Amy. It will do no good to sit around and mope. I can't stay with you. I need to get back and talk to the police." "But I can help you," Amy said, turning to face Mum. Her mum reached out and stroked her cheek. "I know you want to, but you can help by being a good girl and going to school. I don't want to have to worry about Robbie and you." Mum and Catherine hustled her out of bed and to the bathroom to shower. By the time she emerged, dressed in the hated yellow and brown uniform, Mum had already left. Sarah gave her a bright smile which faded when she didn't return it. Catherine set a plate of pancakes on the coffee table, sat behind Sarah and started to plait her hair into a braid. Amy poked at her pancakes and glanced at the TV. It was off. Sarah wasn't allowed to watch TV in the morning. Neither of them said anything. "Do you need some help with your hair, Amy?" Catherine asked. Amy shook her head. "All right, Sarah, go and get dressed." Amy carried her plate into the kitchen as Sarah ran to have a shower. Tim sat at the kitchen table, laptop computer open and research papers around him. He gave Amy a quick nod before turning back to his work. Catherine was packing 2 suspiciously healthy-looking lunches for her and Sarah. Not a hint of chocolate bar to be seen. "Tim," Catherine called, but there was no response. "Tim!" She was slightly louder this time. Tim actually jumped and gave her a startled look. "It's 8:30. Tim nodded, his curly hair looking dishevelled. He took his glasses off and rummaged round in the papers beside him. "Have you seen the car keys, love?" "They should be on the hook by the door," Catherine said. "But they never are," she added, almost under her breath, and Amy smiled as she put her plate in the dishwasher. "No, I had them when I came in last night. I was sure I put them on the table." Tim began a frantic search for the car keys, accompanied by Catherine's long-suffering sigh. It took Tim 15 minutes to find the car keys, by which stage Catherine was following behind him, telling him they would be late. Amy didn't really care if they were late. She didn't want to go to school at all. Tim eventually found the keys, and with her bag in one hand and Sarah's in the other, hurried them out to the car, with Catherine running behind him waving the lunch bags. Tim threw their bags into the back seat. The lunch bags followed. Sarah rearranged them so Amy could fit in. Tim barely waited till she had her seatbelt fastened before tearing down the drive. They arrived just as the bell rang, and once again Tim took their bags and held each of their hands as he raced them to the portable at the back that made up the 5th grade classroom. Mrs. Henderson nodded to him as Amy and Sarah took their place at the back of the line. The second bell rang, and Tim gave Sarah a kiss, handed them their bags, and hurried off. Sarah turned to her, questions in her eyes, but she never got a chance to ask them. Mrs. Henderson took her aside before Sarah could say anything. "How are you feeling, Amy?" "Fine, Mrs. Henderson." "Your mum called me this morning and told me what happened." Amy's eyes filled with tears unexpectedly, and she angrily wiped them away before anyone could see. She didn't want to cry in front of Mrs. Henderson, and certainly didn't want the boys in the class to see her cry. Mrs. Henderson gave her a sympathetic look and guiding her by the shoulders, took her up to the front desk that usually sat empty. It was where the troublemakers had to sit when Mrs. Henderson caught them out, where she could keep an eye on them. Paul, a common visitor to this desk, was already there, and Amy gave Mrs. Henderson a panicked look. Why was she being put at the bad desk? She took the seat beside Paul. Paul didn't look up. He was staring at the desk, not paying attention to anything. Mrs. Henderson put a glass of water in front of each of them. That was normally only allowed when someone was sick. Amy glanced at Sarah, who was sitting beside Emily where she usually sat. Their heads were together and they were whispering. Amy knew that Sarah was bringing Emily up to date on the kidnapping and felt momentarily miffed. It wasn't often she had news this important, and Sarah had beat her to it. Mrs. Henderson handed out the maths sheets and Amy sighed. She hated maths. But when Mrs. Henderson came around to her and Paul, she brought out the coveted colouring sheets instead. "It might make you feel better to keep yourself busy, Paul," she said, and put the sheets and coloured pencils in front of them. Paul must have been feeling sick, she thought, as he listlessly picked up a pencil and started on the sheet. Yarraf, Skara City, 2nd winter moon, 1st day of 6th week. The sun was shining clearly now, streaming in through the arched windows as Yarraf and his friends entered the apprentice classroom for the last time. The dust motes spun and danced in the beams. The desks were packed away. They would not be brought out again until after the spring festival, when the next class of apprentices moved up. 16 boys made up this year's class and were all waiting. Some were going over the spell patterns one last time, while others separated into groups. The boys whispered encouragements and rumours about who the panel would be. Over on one side were the boxes that contained their belongings, one for each boy. Yarraf added his box to the pile. Those who failed the exam today would go straight to the outer rooms and never set foot in the college again. Master Zalef came over as soon as he saw him. "Master Ibsen said you were not well, Yarraf." The apprentice master took his head in his hands, and Yarraf felt the spells flash over him. "I'm all right, master," he said, ashamed that his voice shook. Zalef gestured and handed him the plate of bread and fruit that appeared in his hands. Yarraf looked up at him. "You cannot do the exam hungry. Eat something. I will move you down the list. I don't want you to faint." "Thank you, master," Yarraf said, taking the plate. He had not expected Master Zalef to notice, let alone care. "Benran, you are first. Go through." Anef sat beside him as Benran headed into the exam room. Amy, Australia, September 2nd. Amy ran for the door as the bell rang, not wanting to talk to Mrs. Henderson about her feelings. She glanced back to see Mrs. Henderson duck down beside Paul. "Amy, what happened?" Emily grabbed her arm as soon as she got out of the classroom. Now that it came to it, she didn't want to talk about it, even to Emily and Sarah. Sarah stepped up and answered Emily's questions as they headed for their place on the library steps. It was gratifying how impressed Emily was when Sarah told her about how Amy had fought the monster. "Did you hear about Paul?" Sarah said at last. "He looks sick," Amy said. "I overheard Daniela and Chris talking. His brother got kidnapped last week too. That's why he wasn't here last week." Amy sat up, but it turned out that was all Sarah had heard. She would have to talk to Paul herself. That wasn't going to be easy. Paul was one of the sporty kids and he thought he was better than everyone else, just because he could throw a ball through a hoop. That wasn't that special. But she never got the chance. Mrs. Henderson didn't let them back into the classroom when they returned from morning recess. Instead, she led them to the hall for the special assembly. Constable Frank was there, with a detective from Warrnambool. They talked about the recent abductions and how important it was to tell Mum or Dad, or a teacher, if they saw anything strange. It wouldn't have helped Robbie. She hadn't seen anything strange until the monster arrived. The police kept talking about bad men, but it wasn't a man. Men didn't melt under the bed or cause purple swirly things to appear. They would never find Robbie. They were looking in the wrong place. She glanced over at Paul, but he wasn't paying any attention to her or to what the police were saying. He just sat and stared at his hands. He looked so sad, she could almost feel sorry for him, even if he was an idiot. He must be missing his brother as much as she was. There were police at the gates of the school and news vans as they headed back to the classroom. Mrs. Henderson gave Paul and her another colouring sheet as she handed out work to the rest of the class. Amy waited till someone asked a question and turned to Paul. "Paul?" There was no response. "Paul." "What?" His sullen tone nearly made her give up, but then she remembered how sad he had been at the assembly. Besides, he might be able to give her something more to go on. "My brother got kidnapped by the monster too." There was a long silence, and Amy wondered if Paul had heard her. She was about to repeat it when he answered. "Mum said it was a man dressed as a monster." "Was not. Men don't melt under the bed," Amy said, and Paul turned to face her, then nodded. "It ate Dave," he said, and then turned back to his colouring. Amy was surprised to see tears splash onto the page. Amy made a split-second decision. She looked up to see where Mrs. Henderson was. She was still helping Chris. "It didn't eat him," she whispered. "I saw men. They took Robbie from the monster. He didn't get eaten." Paul looked up, wiping the tears away. "The police won't find them. They're looking in the wrong spot. I'm going to go and get him back. You can come as well, since it took your brother too." There was another long silence, and she started to get angry. It wasn't as if she had to let him come. "Do you know how to fight a monster?" he asked, looking her up and down. "I don't have to fight a monster. It's the bad men we need to get him back from." "All right, you don't have to snap." "I didn't snap. You did." "Did not. Anyway, you don't have to come." "Well, you won't get very far on your own." Amy glared at him. "Do you even know how to get there?" Amy wasn't going to admit she wasn't sure at this point. "Easy. The purple thing is under the bed. We have to go under the bed and want it to come. Then we go through and get Robbie back. And Dave." Amy nodded. "And Dave. And then come home again. And it has to be dark. The monster made a tree fall over to knock out the power." "It was dark when it took Dave," Paul said. "Any bed?" "Well, it came at my house last, but the police are still there. We will have to be really careful when we sneak in." "They are done at my house. It came up from under Dave's bed. It should work there. So you need to get me invited to your house for dinner, so it'll be dark. Mum won't let anyone come over. Anyway, it has to be midnight." "Midnight? Monsters come out at midnight. Everyone knows that." "It wasn't midnight when the monster came last night. It has to be midnight. My parents don't go to bed till 8 anyway, so you'll have to sneak in late." "Fine, whatever." Mrs. Henderson looked them over and they both pretended to be busy with their colouring. Paul bumped her and handed her a note under the desk. "My address. See you tonight. At midnight." At midnight. Yarrath, Skara City, 2nd winter moon, 1st day of 6th week. Yarrath regretted the meal when Master Zalef called him into the exam room. His stomach was threatening rebellion. He came forward and stood in the marked circle and bowed to the panel. "Apprentice Yarrath, begin." Yarrath took a deep breath and started his spells. War was the first discipline. For each discipline, there were 3 exam spells a student could choose to demonstrate his skill. For War, he chose the easiest. He switched his gauge to Mage Sight and teased strands of magic out of the air, arranging them in the required pattern. Another touch of magic set the pattern in place. Now to activate it. If you put the power through the pattern in the wrong order or at the wrong strength, it would either fail to activate or break. He closed his eyes and let his power flow into the pattern, not daring to open them again until he felt the pattern activate. That done, he started the spell. The small wooden ball on the floor in front of him rose and moved through the air in the required sequence. He set it down on the floor before him when done, careful to ensure it made no sound on impact. He looked up at the panel. Zalef nodded to him. He could hear murmurs as the masters discussed each spell, but he could not hear what was said. As he went through a basic shield and blocked a hold spell, he could sense the panel's dissatisfaction with his efforts. He could feel a heat behind his eyes and blinked back tears as he used the handle of a broken cup as a focus to find the rest of it hidden in the room. He must not cry. To show any weakness now would doom him. They were going to send him to the outer rooms. Perhaps it would not be so bad. He would be considered a qualified mage, assigned to a division and given real work rather than study. He wouldn't have a master watching his every move and resenting the time he took up. And Neff and Benran were gifted. There was no question of them passing the exam. If he were assigned to the outer rooms, he would be alone. He completed the weather spell, a fire spell to light the hearth. The healing spell just used teaching patterns. He was not expected to safely spell on a patient at this level. For this one, he stretched himself and used a second-level spell. This spell would close and knit a deep wound. He risked a glance at Zelef. The apprentice master had a slight smile on his face now. For the device spell, he returned to the easy option and set a basic light spell into a small disc of crystal that would activate at a touch. For gates, he set a reference spell for guiding a gate spell into a set area. He glanced up. The frown was back on Zelef's face. He risked a slight smile as he reached illusions. This he could do. He set the third pattern and heard some of the panel gasp as an illusion of a flower of the sun appeared before them. This he held at least a mark before dropping the spell. Zelef was smiling broadly now. He hesitated before the last spell. Mines was the most difficult and most dangerous of all the disciplines. It was also the discipline in which Lord Rentock held his mastery. Consequently, the mine masters held a privileged position in the college. Again he went for the third spell, a full mine shield. As with healing, it was considered too dangerous for the apprentices to attempt a full spell. He set the teaching pattern before him, setting it in place but not activating it. He held it long enough for the masters to check it over for any flaws, then dropped the spell. The exam done, he bowed low. Zelef was frowning again when he looked up. "Are there any other spells you wish to show us, Apprentice Yarif?" This was an extra chance to display any special gifts to the masters. Yarif hesitated. He did have a spell prepared, but it didn't always work. A failed spell would look worse than none at all. His legs were shaking and his stomach still in knots. "No, my lord." "Very well, you are dismissed." Yarif bowed again, then fled. Amy, Australia, September 2nd. Emily had piano lessons over lunch, so Amy managed to get Sarah off on her own. "You can't be serious, Amy. Mum won't let you stay over at a boy's house. Anyway, you don't like Paul. That's not very Christian of you. Paul should be allowed to come because his brother is missing, whether I like him or not," Amy said. Sarah blushed. "Anyway," Amy said, "I'm not going to ask your mum if I can go. She isn't my mum and can't tell me what to do." "Your mum wouldn't let you stay over at a boy's house either." "Yes, she would," Amy said, and Sarah shook her head. "Anyway, I'm not going to ask her either. Paul's house is by the river. It isn't that far to walk from your place. It won't take more than half an hour." Sarah gaped. "You can't walk around by yourself in the dark. It's dangerous." "So come with me, then I won't be by myself." Sarah went white and shook her head. "Come on, Sarah, your mum won't even know. We'll sneak out to Paul's, go through, get Robbie back, take Robbie home, tell him to ring the doorbell. Mum will find him, and then we sneak back to your house and no one will ever know we've been gone." "What if it takes more than a day to find him?" "Magic Kingdoms put you back where you were when you left. Everyone knows that. No time will have gone from when we leave, even if it takes a year." "A year?" She probably shouldn't have said that. "Mum will know if we're gone for a year. We can cut her hair so it doesn't look like it grew." "You'll be taller," Sarah pointed out. "It won't take a year. I thought you were my friend, Sarah." "I am." "But you won't help me find Robbie." Amy plonked down on the steps and opened a lunch bag. There was an apple, a mandarin, and a chicken salad sandwich. She opened up the sandwich and picked out the cucumber, the tomato, and the carrot, leaving nothing but lettuce and chicken. The police are looking for Robbie, Sarah said, opening her sandwich and tucking in with every sign of enjoyment. The police won't find him because they're looking for a bad man, not a monster. There's no such thing as monsters. Mum said so, Sarah said with her mouth full. Amy frowned in thought. Then there won't be anything there. If the police are right, we'll go to Paul's house, nothing will happen, and we can go home. Your mum won't know. She looked at the sandwich again and picked out the lettuce. Sarah frowned at that. She will be so mad. No, she won't, because she won't know. If we tell Dad, maybe he will drive us over and wait for us, if it'll only take a few minutes. No, Sarah, they can't know. Why was Sarah such a scaredy cat? I'll go on my own then, and you can explain to your mum where I've gone. Ha, Amy thought, as Sarah dropped her apple into the lunch bag and stared at her with wide eyes. That settles it then, Amy said with a bright smile. Tonight we'll get Robbie back. She shoved the last of the sandwich into the bag, walked to the bin, and tipped the rest of the salad and fruit in. She would borrow some money from Emily for chips from the canteen at afternoon recess. Yarrowth, Skara City, second winter moon, first day of week 6. Yarrowth hugged his knees as they waited for the last candidate to finish. The knot in his stomach still wound tight. Benran sat at the window beside him, clearly bored, eyes on the garden, which was sunny for the first time after a week of snow and rain. Anef was tense at his other side, dreading the coming separation as much as he was. He rose as the door opened and the panel came out. The boys all lined up in the centre of the room and bowed as the masters filed out the door. The room felt like a storm waiting to break. Master Zelef was furious. Anef, Zelef called. Anef bowed to him, and Zelef gestured for him to sit off to the side. Benran? Master. Benran bowed and went to join Anef. Yarrowth held his breath. Yarrowth. It took Yarrowth a moment to realise that Zelef had actually called his name. He bowed and went to sit beside Anef. Anef gripped his hand tightly and rested his head against his shoulder. Benran gave his other arm a quick shake to get his attention, then grinned at him. Yarrowth did not relax. The tension in the room kept building until it felt it would crush him. Master Zelef called out no more names. Never before have only 3 boys passed the exam. It is a disgrace. Yarrowth flinched, each word a blow. Zelef spoke in a soft tone, but it felt as if he was shouting. He hugged his knees as Master Zelef listed the failings of the class in excruciating detail. The boys in front of him hung their heads. A few burst into tears. Anger and disappointment circled the room until Yarrowth wanted to scream. He couldn't. So he gripped Anef's hand, hunched his shoulders, and let it wash over him. An age passed before Zelef stopped speaking, and when Yarrowth looked up at the timepiece, he had to take a second look. The marker on the timepiece had only dropped 3 marks. Master Onzrin, master of the outer rooms, stood silently in the doorway. The boys collected their boxes and lined up in 2 lines and marched out. Yarrowth? Yarrowth looked up. Are you well? Zelef was crouched in front of him now, only concern in his tone. Yes, master. He could not get the shake out of his voice. All right, get your boxes and return to your rooms, all of you. The patterns for the discipline exam are on your desks. Amy, Australia, September 2nd. The afternoon passed with excruciating slowness. Amy tried to read as Sarah had her clarinet lessons after school. She rolled round on the floor and bounced on the trampoline as Sarah did her gymnastics. She forced herself to make small talk with Catherine over homework and dinner, thinking all the while of that evening and finally finding Robbie. Mum dropped in after dinner and it was all Amy could do not to blurt out her plans. Tomorrow morning Mum would wake up and Robbie would be home. Her smile would be back. She wouldn't even mind living in that horrible house if they could all be together again. But she couldn't tell Mum. Not yet. Not until she found Robbie. She was more worried that Sarah would say something. Sarah kept very quiet, and kept looking at her all the way through dinner, so much that Catherine noticed it. Fortunately, Catherine decided it must have been worry for Robbie, but Amy gave Sarah a quick kick under the table as a warning. It was easier after dinner. Sarah frowned and entreated her to tell Tim and Catherine what they were doing, as if they would actually help them. Amy knew better. If the grown-ups got wind of her plans, they would be locked up and Robbie would be lost. Despite Amy's fears, Sarah said nothing to her parents, and when Amy pointed out they might need to take some things with them, not only came up with 2 sleeping bags and travel pillows, but a small tent. Food was harder to get. Despite having studies on the ground floor level, built half underground, Tim and Catherine preferred to work in the kitchen. Sarah told her mum there was a food drive and came up with 2 cans of tomato soup and a pack of instant noodles, but they would need more. It took Amy nearly an hour to convince Sarah they couldn't live only on tomato soup and noodles. Sarah was already upset she had lied to her mother. Eventually, after making sure Tim and Catherine were engrossed in their work, Sarah led her downstairs. Amy hesitated as Sarah opened the door from the foyer to go down into the den. It was pitch black down there, and even after Sarah turned on the light, she hesitated. The den was built into the ground, its windows nearly at the same level as the roof. Normally it was a fun play area, but today, with memories of the monster, it was slightly sinister and full of strange shadows just beyond the light. Amy steeled herself. She couldn't be scared of the dark, not if she was going to rescue Robbie. Sarah looked nervous too, but for a very different reason. She kept glancing up back at the stairs as they headed for Tim's office. This was the only place in their house that wasn't spotless. Paper and folders were scattered over the desk, the floor, and piled up on the chair. Sarah moved the folders from the chair, wheeled it over to a filing cabinet, and opened the top drawer. She pulled out a jar, and Amy's eyes opened wide. It was full of chocolate and lollies. Sarah gave her a sly smile. "He thinks Mum and I don't know about this," she said. "He keeps moving it around, but only between a few hiding places." Amy held her bag open as Sarah poured the lollies in. "He won't notice it missing? He will think Mum found it and threw it out. He's meant to be on a diet." Sarah grinned back at her, and Sarah put the empty jar in the drawer and closed it, piling the folders back on Tim's chair. "What are you 2 doing down there?" Getting my paints," Sarah said, racing to the shelf and pulling a box down. They headed back up the stairs. "Thanks," Amy said, giving her hand a squeeze. "For what?" "For not telling on me. You're my best friend. Best friends don't tell on each other. So you'll come with me?" Sarah didn't answer, and Amy couldn't pursue the matter with Catherine there. Sarah had said they were doing painting, so they had to do some painting. But her mind never left the packed bags that were ready under the bed.